So lately I've been thinking a lot about the words we speak. I speak a lot of them. And the narratives that we tell and the things that we believe. I've been thinking a lot about this concept of words. And it's all centered around language. All of these things are centered around this concept of language. And it's based on, it's based on definitions, which is really then based on our perceptions, which is based on, if we're honest, our own personal experiences. And so language, I've heard it said that there's no concrete definition to most things, because even that might have a definition, but how we understand that and relate to that thing changes. So it becomes an organic thing when we're dealing with a certain word or a certain belief system. So many of us are saying, what I've noticed, especially when it comes to faith and spirituality, so many of us are saying similar things, really similar things, but in different ways. So for instance, one thing I can think of straight off the top of my head is I'll hear some of my friends say things like, well, the universe knew, the universe provides. And then I'll hear some of my friends say, well, God knows, God provides. And then I'll hear someone else say something similar but a different language. And I'm thinking, we're saying very similar things, that we're using different language for it, but there is a thing in essence that knows and is providing and caring for. And so you get into this idea of if we're paying attention, some things, not all things, but some things can be pretty similar, that we're trying to get at the same thing. But oftentimes we get hung up on a certain word. Right? So for those that are like, the universe is woo-woo, you get caught up on the word universe. And you're like, what do you mean by that? For those of you that are like, I don't really like the word God, you get caught up on the word God. And you get blocked when taking a moment to pause and think, what is it they're trying to say? And are we actually saying similar things here? And so a word like God, for instance, this very word, I think this very word God is sort of like a kaleidoscope, if you will, that it appears differently to each eye. And so you have what looks so different, and you're describing what you see, and it's vastly different. So sometimes our perceptions, they can lead to misunderstandings and conflict, which we've probably experienced them from time to time. You experience this misunderstanding, this conflict. No, this is what I'm saying. This is what I'm saying. And what we say and what is heard can be two different things. This has happened to me personally in friendships. I'm sure it's happened to me with my wife, where there's times where I'm like, we're saying the same thing, or no, that's not what I mean. And you can't control, and that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight, but you can't control how someone receives what you say. That is just out there. But you can control how clear you articulate what you're saying. That's about all you can do there. So it's interesting when we say something and someone hears something different. Things like when we say God, what do we mean? When we say love, what do we mean? And that's a tough one, because we think love is this, that, and the other, until you hear someone use the word love and they use it in a certain context. Well, this was loving. And you go, that doesn't feel loving to me. That's not my definition, right? So what do you mean? When we say things like equal rights, what do we mean? Justice, fairness, what do we mean? Then things get trickier when we start talking about stories from sacred texts. What do we mean by that? How are we trying to interpret that? And what is the intent behind it all? So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about an ancient tower. We're going to talk about misunderstandings. We're going to talk about the words we speak, our intentions behind them, and our ego, which is not a fun thing to talk about, but we're going to talk about that. So let's start with the tower first. And some of you that have been born and raised in church or been around religion long enough know where this story goes. There's an ancient story of the book of Genesis about a people that decide to build a city. This is obviously not a picture because there were not cameras back then. This is just a rough painting, replica of maybe what could have happened. So there's an ancient story of the book of Genesis of a people that decide to build a city. And in this city, they decide to build a tower that could reach the very heavens. At least that's their desire. And the story takes place roughly about 4,000 years ago, a much different time from ours, a very, very different way of understanding and being in the world. And their perceptions and understandings not only of each other, but of God and how the universe was structured, vastly, vastly different. You could probably say that the way they understood things and their consciousness was We're probably a little bit more developed than them, let's guess. Although sometimes the way we live, maybe not. And so, but the thing that's fascinating about this is the core of the human heart is still pretty similar. The core of the human heart is still pretty similar. It's why we keep telling these stories. We go, yes, there's something here that's really similar. So they were settlers in an ancient valley of Babylon. And it's what we would be south of what we know as Baghdad in Iraq. So in case you're going, where is that? This gives you a rough idea. So it's in this kind of desert landscape in the Middle East. And it's been said that every ancient writer, this is something that I found interesting, that every ancient writer that mentions Babylon, they mention it with a tone of awe and reverence. There's something about this city. It was powerful and advanced in its technology. And so it's believed that after they settled, so after they said, hey, we're going to go here and start this thing, a king then emerges, an authoritarian ruler. And wait for it, his name, some of you might know this, his name is Nimrod. Anyone ever hear that word before? Yeah. How do you normally hear it? Green Day. Yeah, I was waiting for someone to say that. High five to you. Green Day, if you don't know that, it's a band, and that's the name of their album. Yes. What's the other way you normally hear the word Nimrod? Insult. Yeah. Usually means like a jerk, an idiot, foolish person, right? So the guy's name is Nimrod. Gives you a correlation that when you're calling someone a Nimrod, it really has very, very ancient roots. The word Nimrod actually meant in Hebrew rebel. So he's this person that his name alone invokes, hey, this guy is probably a rebel in not the good kind of way, the kind you probably don't want to be associated with. Some rabbinical literature, it defines his name as he who made all people rebellious against God. So not only is he a rebel, but he invokes rebellion in other people. So it's kind of wearing off on other people. And so there's like an essence about him, an essence about this Nimrod fellow that is solely focused on self, and it's solely focused on power and control. And so it's been said that Nimrod didn't feel very secure in his reign as a ruler. He felt quite insecure, and he feared that one of Noah's descendants would claim his throne. So here's what I envision: a ruler who emerged, the people, it sounded like, wanted him. And he then is sort of this arrogant, rebellious ruler who is actually quite insecure. And so he refused to be challenged, is the story. I see some people laughing. He refused to be challenged, and he was set on building an empire. And here we have a city that everything, literally, they had everything they wanted. When you start reading a little bit about this city, they had everything that they wanted, and they were advanced and well-resourced. So the city is built next to a river, and anytime you have a city next to a river, it gives you a clue. They're probably doing quite well because it's an indicator of provision and wealth. At that time, even now, we have to be honest, that is a resource. It's a valuable resource. So this is a city that probably was well-structured from what we've seen, and it has all kinds of wealth and resource coming into it. So they had enough water, which means enough food or water to drink, enough food for your to grow your crops, and enough water for your cattle and livestock. So it's affecting all kinds of ways, and probably travel down the river. So you have import-export. So it gives you an idea of sort of this city. And then you have this city that pretty much has it all. They have everything they could want. They have this arrogant ruler who's doing everything. What more could these people want? Well, an insanely tall tower. I mean, of course, like when you have everything, why not just build all of the largest structures in the world? So a tower. So the people said, come, let us build us a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Fascinating. We may make a name for ourselves. When I hear that, I instantly think, whoa, that is very egoic. Now, there's a lot of things in biblical literature about naming. Naming's very powerful. There's a lot going on in this story. But if we just kind of stick up here high level, you hear these people that are like, yeah, we've got it all and then some. Now let's go ahead and build literally, at this time, the world's largest structure that'll reach the heavens, and we're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to be amazing. And so it's a city that had everything it wanted So this city would have been sort of like a nation. It has everything it wanted, and yet it emulates the same insecurities as its ruler. It has a desire for fame, it has a desire for power, and it has a desire from control. Now, this is not at all where the rest of the story is going this evening, so you're probably going to be like, how does this correlate? What I find fascinating is, isn't it bizarre that a story that's so far removed, like 4,000 years old, so far removed, is somehow still eerily true of today? You read that and you think, yeah, I've seen the way that's now in our history, but the ways in which it repeats itself through history. We see this in every culture. Every culture, we see a ruler raised up, we see power, ego, control. And then after all of this is said and done, the famous Tower of Babel, or as some people call it, Babel, but I don't like to say that word. I was raised to say Babel, so we're going to go with it. The famous Tower of Babel is erected. Now, the story then ends with a really bizarre twist, and many of you may know this, and if you don't, get ready for it, because it's weird. So after all is said and done, and you have this ruler, and it's this thing, and we're going to build this tower, we're going to reach the heavens, then God comes down. I don't know from where, from his house, let's say in heaven. God comes down, visits the city to see what they're up to, saw what they were doing, and then decides to confuse their language so that they can no longer understand each other, and then scattered them all over the earth. Have you ever heard this story? Got a few people, and a few people are like, no. Does anyone else think that's bizarre? At least the ending. The beginning, you're like, I can really see that. That's pretty normal, but that ends a little like what? So I actually have no idea what happened, right? I'm not going to go ahead and give you some long exegetical reason why I think this is what happened. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there 4,000 years ago. But I will be honest, I personally have a really hard time believing that God sort of dipped down and stirred everyone up like human soup and made everyone really confused and then threw them all over the earth. I think what we're getting here is sort of an ancient depiction at what could have happened with the birth of language. Who knows, though? 4,000 years removed could have been a real thing. I have no idea. So why don't we go ahead and take a quick look at the history and then the metaphor, because we are going somewhere with this, somewhere that connects 4,000 years ago to something very present now. So various ancient historians have written about such a tower and a ruler. And what's really interesting to me is this bizarre story, as weird as it is, isn't just biblical. This story has been told with fascinating variations, all kinds of different variations throughout history. So we have everything from different cultures and myths ranging from Mexico to Africa telling similar stories. Variables along the way, but very similar stories. Some believed even that Nimrod, it's still funny to say that name, is actually a retelling of the ancient Greek god Orion, who was this ruler, also very fascinating. Then the Quran itself has similar stories. It's two different stories. They kind of have this story broken up into two different stories, one about a tower, and then one about a wind that comes through and confuses everyone's language. And so it's this interesting way that they have this story of, yeah, there's something that happened here. There was a ruler and a tower and control, and yet there also was this confusion. Even right here in Arizona, this I thought was really interesting. In Arizona, there's a similar story told by the Tohono O'odham natives of the Sonoran Desert. And I was like, I've never heard this in my entire life. So it's a story of the mythological god Montezuma, which we've probably all heard of Montezuma. So it's a story of this mythological god Montezuma who escaped a great flood, sound familiar, became evil, which it's kind of like a different telling on a story, became evil and controlling. Then he sets out plans, this god Montezuma sets out plans to build a house that would reach the heavens, only to have it destroyed by the great spirit who sent wind and thunderbolts. Very fascinating. Different, right? But you have sort of a, wait a minute. Now, if I'm honest, anytime you have a retelling of something like this in history, you get a sense that it's probably rooted in some sort of truth, right? There's probably some sort of truth rooted in there, whether it's historical or philosophical. It's like, yeah, something probably happened. We're not entirely sure what. But then my younger self So my younger self would have just said, this biblical story is the only way, this is fact, this happened literally this way. Then my more progressive self would have said, is this even historically true? I would have gotten real hung up on that for a long time. Is this really real? Is this fact? Is this historically true? I need to know all of the things behind this. But if I'm honest, where I'm at right now is anytime I see a story sprinkled like this again and again, I get this idea and I pause and I think, just what are they trying to say? I'm no longer after the historical truth, although the history of it still really fascinates me. Love that. I'm no longer after that anymore. I'm going, wait a minute. People all over have been telling this really weird, bizarre story. Why? Why have they been telling this story? What does it mean? Why did they tell this story enough so that they could carry it down to the next generation? There has to be some sort of purpose. So what is the truth in this story? Now, this has been interpreted a lot of different ways, and I find a few of them really fascinating. Some of them are just, kind of scratch the surface. Some of them go really deep. But one thing I wanted to hone in on is sort of what this happens with this egoic ruler and this confusion of language. And we're going to hone in on this. So the very word Babel or Babel means confusion. So the very word itself means confusion. And these people weren't the only ones confused by words. How many of you are confused by words from time to time? A little bit. You're like, I don't know what that means, especially when someone's speaking in a different language. It's really challenging. So confusion is often found in language. The words we speak, they can be the source of healing. The words we speak can be the source of great damage. The words we speak can really unite or divide. They're complex. Language is really complex. So what is the intent behind them, I think, is always the fascinating question. What is someone meaning when they say that? You ever hear someone say something really literal? It should be obvious, but you know there's an implied statement underneath that. Like, you just know it. And you kind of lean in like, just what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by that? I know that's not what you mean. What is really going on in here? And so there's sort of like this, like, okay, there's something really happening. And that's the nuance of language. That's the nuance of storytelling. That's the nuance of biblical scripture. There's so much, like, what do you mean by that? An anonymous author once wrote, a single moment of misunderstanding is so poisonous that it makes us forget the 100 lovable moments spent together within a minute. Ooh, has anyone been there? It's like a single moment of misunderstanding, and you're kind of like, I don't know how we got here. Anyone else been there? And it's so disheartening. It's so disheartening because you do forget the 100 lovable moments spent together. It's like something happens and instantly you find yourself like on a battleground and you're going, I don't understand. We used to be friends. We used to be this. We used to be, what just happened? And this is the power of language that sometimes we forget, the power of our words that we forget. And I know that often we can't avoid misunderstandings. But I think it's imperative that we learn how to repair them. I've heard it once said that when our hair grows, right, we cut it, right? Especially me, I cut mine often. When your hair grows, you cut it, not your head. When your fingernails grow, you cut your nails, not your fingers. When our misunderstandings grow, we should cut our ego, not our relationships. That is really hard. Cut your ego, not your relationships. We live in a world that's severing relationships left and right, when the ego is the thing that needs to go to the door. Now, how does this tie in with the tower? We'll get back to that. So what causes misunderstandings? Let's go here for a minute. What causes misunderstandings? I think there's a lot of things that cause misunderstandings. We could probably go for weeks on what are the misunderstandings. I want to focus on two that I think would be helpful for us, and two that I've experienced. And one is our perceptions, and two, our egos. I think these are things that can cause misunderstandings faster than we give them credit for. So let's start with the first one, our perceptions. A wise, dear friend of mine once told me that perception forms our reality. And she said that our perception is our reality. And I thought about that. I thought that's so interesting, that when you have you ever had an argument with someone and you're thinking like, that's not even that's not even what I said. That's not even real. And I instantly want to go like, that's not true. That's not true. It's true for them. And that is so challenging to be like, your reality is not my reality. And somehow in your world, this is your reality. And so it can get really, really tricky. And this is why you can get many interpretations of the same thing. You get many interpretations of the same sacred text, the same word. You can all come about it with a different perspective because each individual has a different perception. There's an illustration you might have seen before. And I think it kind of illustrates this idea, which, by the way, they have awesome hair. I'm like, what's happening there? It illustrates, which is so weird, this optical illusion. It illustrates this idea that they're looking at the same thing, right? They're looking at the exact same object. From this person's perspective, that person is correct. It is 3, right? If you're counting right now, it is 3. You look at that person's perspective, they are correct. It's 4. And it's sort of like, which we'll touch base in a few weeks when we do our interfaith series, it's sort of like that one picture where you see people trying to describe an elephant. Each person is describing something that is true, but they're approaching it from a very different angle. So that is their perception. It's like, no, this is where I'm coming from. This is what I see. And so this is often what happens with our perception. Is sometimes, yes, sometimes people are just flat out wrong. Sometimes I'm flat out wrong. But there are times where it's like, wait, let's pause and dig in deeper. What causes them to have that perception in the first place? What is it that they're seeing? So when it comes to perception, how do we understand and define things? Like, we should be asking these things of our perception. What experiences have we had around that subject or idea? Now, here's what's hard. That's hard enough work, but then take it a step further when you have a conversation with someone else, digging in deeper to saying, how does the other person define things? What experiences have they had around that subject or idea? So, anybody have any conflict with family, friends, we'll leave it at that, maybe other people, around topics of faith? Got a few shaking heads, yep. And it's challenging because you're 3 and they're 4. You're like, no, this is the way. I feel that often with my own family of this, how can you not see it this way? How can you not? And then when I apply this, I think they can't because that's not their perception. They've never been around to the other side, if we're talking sides. And I don't want to make it dualistic. But for illustration point, you can't expect someone to see something unless they've been able to come from that vantage point. So this is the importance from being able to have a willingness to hear other people's stories. This is why it's so important. When someone's shouting something that they've gone through, an injustice, they're talking about a thing, a pain point, something they're experiencing, and you're on the other side and they're like, I don't see it that way. Sometimes it's okay to disagree, right? The goal is not agreement. The goal is like, is there a way we can have empathy here? So sometimes going around to their side and being like, well, tell me your story. I'm going to cool off long enough to be like, tell me your story. Like, I know we are different. I know we might worship differently. I know we might think differently. I know we might fill in the blank, view these people differently, vote this way, but what brought you to that point of view? I think that would help us a lot, and it's challenging to do, really challenging. It would help us a lot in a political climate right now of, okay, I may absolutely disagree with you. What brought you to that, though? I want to know what brought you to that point. Tell me about your story. Tell me about your life. Tell me about your experiences. And then vice versa. Now, here's the hard part, is you're not always going to get the other person that wants to do that work. That's the hardest part. And I'm noticing when it comes to conflict, to when things get lost in translation, to confusion, sometimes when you're the person that has moved from one perspective to another, you have to be, I want to be careful of how I say it, sometimes you're the one that ends up having to do a lot of the work. Anyone experience that? And it could be, and it's not about who's better. It's not about right or wrong. It's that you have seen one thing and now you've seen another. This person may not. And so you're having to do a little bit of work with this person. I don't know if my parents ever watched this, but let's go there for a minute. Talking to my parents is a very similar thing. When I talk about God, when I talk about this church, when I talk about what I'm experiencing, I don't often, first of all, let's start there, I don't often, because I know when I do, it'll be like talking in a foreign language. That's how it is. It's like talking in a foreign language. It's met with a lot of like, I don't know what you're saying. And I get frustrated, and it's so maddening, and I get hurt, and I'm like, I wish you could see things this way. And then I pause and I think, that's not where they're at in their journey. And absolutely, it can be my duty to help sprinkle some things and bring them along. But at the end of the day, how can they see this if they've never even walked that? You can't. But being open is, I think, the first step with anything, at least being open to hear something. So the more we try to see things from another person's vantage point, I don't care what it pertains to. Take the thing that you probably are the most uncomfortable with. Oh, and that's challenging. The more we try to sit in that, the more we might gain some understanding and empathy. It doesn't mean we'll agree with them. We still may end up going, okay, I see how you got there. I still think you're wrong. Okay? But at least there's a sense of, instead of a quick dismissal, it's like I've sat with you long enough to know how you got here. Oh, I know that you're racist because of this, that, and the other. Oh, I know that you actually are really scared of LGBTQ people because of this, that, and the other. Or the opposite. I know you're gay and you're actually terrified and almost intense towards straight people. Why? Because your story. Okay. Well, now that we've gotten that out and we've defined some things, now let's move on. So when we hear these things, I think it's important that we surround ourselves with people, which is challenging because we like to be tribalistic, that we surround ourselves with people and beliefs and experiences different from ourselves. I think that's really important. I think it's hard work. I think it should be done safely and wisely, and not everyone deserves that time. However, it's important to get around people that are willing to have any kind of conversation. So just for an example, just because I was deeply curious, I didn't know who would be here tonight and how this would go. But when you hear the word God, what does that mean to you? So we'll start with that, because that's sort of like a big, giant word. But let's go there, and you can shout out anything you want to say. When you hear the word God, what does that mean to you?
Father.
Did you say Father? Father. Okay. I think I just heard two people that said creator. Okay? What's that? Divine.
The ground of being itself.
Ground of being itself.
Ambiguous.
Ambiguous. Expectation. Ooh, I love those. See, then it piques my interest because I want to be like, okay, what does that mean to you? And why? And let's get at what does that mean? So when I'm talking about God and you're hearing expectation, does that mean you feel like God expects something from you? Or, you know what I'm saying? So you start to go, okay, now we're not talking, now we're not using the same, we might be using a similar word, but now we're talking about some different things. And so now we kind of have the opposite. Instead of different language talking about the same things, we now have a different problem. We're using the same word and have very different definitions, which is, I think, really challenging. When you're just assuming, oh yeah, we're on the same page. No, we're not. Okay. And so then pausing to reflect and understand, well, Nate has a different journey. And so what is this journey for you that makes you think this way about this word? Patty has a different journey. What is it about your journey? I would love to hear that. What is it that invokes that word Father? What does that mean to you? Ambiguous. What does that mean to you and why? And I think it's important to take a word and then love when we hear love, right? We hear that word, but when you hear love applied, what does love applied look like? That can look very different for a lot of people. It can look different for a lot of people. Some people will say that all kinds of what we would probably call injustices, they would say that's love. And I'd go, I don't think so. So it's really interesting to kind of get at what are those experiences that we have behind the words we say. Now, sometimes our perceptions, as I mentioned before, can lead to misunderstanding and conflict. And this is something that's super helpful because I don't want people to get lost in trying to manage what other people how other people react. That's not the goal of this at all. So one thing that's super helpful is a statement that says, I'm responsible for what I say to you, not for what you understand. Okay, so we can practice that. I'm responsible for what I say to you, not for what you understand. But you have to see there's a caveat with that. That means we should be clear in what we're saying. We should be very clear in what we're saying. If we have expectations, we should be clear about those expectations. And that's hard. It's really hard. I'll be totally dead transparent. I like to pride myself as someone that's good at communication. And if I'm honest, this year has been the worst, most painful experience for me as a human being to realize all the ways in which I'm not good at communication at all. Ways in which I thought was just fine, and then I discover, oh my gosh, I did something without even realizing it that really hurt that person. I did something without realizing it that someone took a different way. I'm not responsible for that, but they did. And realizing all of these different things. And so letting this go of I'm not responsible for what people hear, but I certainly am responsible for the things I say. Now, however, with that being said, I do think we have, as I said, an opportunity to be a little clear with what we say. And every language can be another way of looking at reality. So let's focus on this for a minute. Every language can be another way of looking at reality. I'm kind of just riffing a little bit tonight. I did this last time. I was like, let's just kind of go with an idea and then pull a string and see where it goes. That every language can be, if we let it, another way of looking at reality. Anyone in here bilingual? We have a couple people. Okay. So, what languages do you speak? Okay, American Sign Language and English. German, and obviously English. At least that's what I'm hearing. Who knows? Well, let's go for you two, but I have heard it said that there's certain words that can't quite be translated the same in another language. So you try to find the next best thing. Or there's a language, I've heard this often, there might be a language in Spanish that means this one thing, and then come to find out you can't describe it in English. And we see this every time we go to Mexico. Somebody tries to describe, well, it's kind of like this. And they're like, but not really. And so then we're over here like, I'm not sure. So every language has a way of sort of looking at a different version of reality and expressing it. And I think that could be an ambiguous statement of maybe in many ways that's our spiritual expressions. In many ways, maybe that's our racial diversity. All of these things that we're doing have a different, I think, window and eyes to see the divine, if we let it. So let's move on to what I think is the most painful point, and I think we're quickly moving through this last section. The most, I think, painful point about misunderstanding altogether is our ego. So our focus solely on self and our inability to listen can create major understandings. Major understandings. And sometimes it's so underneath the surface we don't realize we're doing it. So the ego likes to attach itself to labels. Our ego likes to attach itself to labels, to positions, to leadership, things like that. And dualistic words like this, that, them, us, either or type categories. And the thing that I found so fascinating about this entire story, to circle it back to the beginning, is this leader, Nimrod, is found numerous times. It's fascinating. I found a few abstracts online that a few of these scholars talked about Nimrod being an archetypal ego figure. That you have this ruler that is literally this archetypal ego figure. And it's interesting, and this instantly for me piqued my interest, this idea of an ego figure, is what happens the second the ego is driving something. It literally is destroyed. So you have an ego figure that decides, hey, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to reach God, I'm going to be like God, whatever was in his mind, right? I'm going to control, power, dominate. When he's in that place of leadership from power, control, and self, it led to confusion and separation. And we like to pin this, I think, to current leaders, this story. We like to pin this to current leaders in this category at this time. And if we're honest, after all, it's probably pretty extremely easy to do. Yet, I think it's super important that we pause and do a little bit of self-examination. That this projection, this ego projection, is something that we all possess. Ugh, I hate that. I hate that, but it's reality. And I know it. I know it because I felt those moments of, oh, here we go. I know this is not the good part of me talking. When our ego is the driving force of the words we communicate, it often will result in what I would call noise. When it's driving in that communication, it's noise, it's confusion, it's separation. Anyone have any great examples? Because I'm deeply curious, and you don't need to go into all the dirty laundry of it. Does anyone here have a good example of how, when your ego is the driving force of a conversation, how it can result in noise? Does anything off the top of your head come to mind? Yeah.
Whenever I was, so this week I work with kids, and whenever I did a subject next to myself, it just sounded like noise. Talking to the kids, and trying to get them to listen, it just sounded like noise.
Okay. So for those on live stream that couldn't hear, so you're leading kids, and it's not in a space you're wanting to be at this time. And so something else is driving that conversation. You're talking to these kids, and it's just sounding like noise. It's not resonating. Yeah. Anyone? Yes?
I would say when my ego is the priority, I tend to not listen, instead be preparing my answer already to prove that I'm right instead of listening to the other person.
Yep, damn straight. Can I get a hallelujah to that? Anybody with me on that one? I mean, it's terrible where you're like, what am I going to prepare next? Yep, okay, so I read this thing once. I saw this quote once. Yes. But listening just to listen? Yeah. What about social media? How do you think social media is for this one?
I think it makes it a lot worse. Because everybody's doing that. I think people either inflates their ego or just tears them down completely, and there's,
Yep.
too.
So it's an amplifier. We could say social media is an amplifier. I would say that's the first visual I get of social media, is almost like an amplifier and someone with a guitar cranked to 12. Just, bam, this is what we're hearing. It's just amplified. What is on a very small, minuscule scale is now just projected, which I think is actually probably our work as humans on this time, at this very moment on this planet, is to work through this. If we don't work through this side of ourselves, we could be repeating a very vicious cycle. We know where that goes. So Richard Rohr, of course, I love Richard Rohr. I wonder if you all could maybe play like a game. Every time I don't mention Richard Rohr, you can like place a bet. So Richard Rohr says these wise words. The ego gets what it wants with words. The soul finds what it needs in silence. So the ego gets what it wants with words. The soul finds what it needs in silence. And that is true. The second we're quick to come up with a rebuttal, right? Because we're all guilty of it. The second we're like, this is the thing I'm going to say. Oh, I should have told them. The second we're quick to go on a rant. Or maybe it's not even in like major malice, right? Because sometimes the ego, if we're honest, sometimes the ego is masked as goodness. Sometimes the ego is masked as the professional, the guru, the pastor. The ego is masked as all kinds of things. We also have to recognize that it gets what it wants with words, and sometimes what we need to do is be silent. And so I think there's many ways to bring in that silence, and I think that sometimes the cure for the misunderstanding is silence. So this space, this empty space of listening, of silence, for those that practice meditation or prayer, being rather than doing, this is the energy that creates. This is the energy that creates and the energy that heals. And I think after all, our ancestors tell of that story, that out of nothing comes from something. Out of empty space, an entire cosmos is born. So words, they may help us differentiate things. Labels, definitions, descriptions, they're helpful and they're necessary, but they can alienate, they can be limiting. And so we need these empty spaces, the silence. It's in these moments of silence that it gives way beyond verbal language. Have you tried to have a conversation with someone that you don't speak the same language? Anyone? You find a way to communicate. Matt was telling me a story before service, and he used the word exchange. And I thought that was fascinating. He was talking about, if you don't mind, I won't say what. There was a moment that he had And it involved no words, but an exchange with another human. And I found it fascinating that what he was describing was there was a conversation. There was a conversation, but no words were said. So a look in the eye, a gesture, a hug, you have an exchange. Peter Drucker, who does a lot of management stuff, he says this phrase: the most important thing in communication is to hear what isn't being said. Right now, I think, this is my own just personal thought as a human, right now I think our world needs more silence. And that's hard to practice. I don't always practice it well. That's why I have a morning thing. I have a morning ritual every time. I need a time of just be quiet and plug in and listen. Just listen. What's not being said? So right now we hear what a lot is being said. We hear that magnified, as we were talking about an amplifier. We're hearing a lot of that. What's not being said, though? Because there's probably some things that aren't being said, which is, I'm hurt, I don't feel seen, I'm scared, I'm terrified, I feel judged, how could we get here? I'm in sorrow, agony, grief, I'm frustrated, who are we becoming? There's all kinds of things that maybe aren't being said under the surface. And it's coming out as sort of this verbal back and forth. So when words fail, I want to leave you with this thought. Matt, if you want to come at this time. When words fail, and we tend to feel sort of the rise of, let's call Nimrod the Great. When you become a Nimrod, when words fail and the ego rises, silence can be the great interpreter. And so I think what that means, it doesn't necessarily mean literal silence, but I do think it can mean having a willingness to listen. And I think it can mean having a willingness to pause, having a willingness to rest. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is disengage from something and come back to it. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is sit and listen to someone's story before you speak. So I want to offer that. This has been on my mind a lot. A couple weeks ago, I also went on this talk about the illusion of separateness. And I can't help but think there's sort of this cycle that I keep thinking as a society, as people, as human beings, probably since the beginning of time, this idea that we feel like we are separate. We feel like we are separate from God, and we feel like we are separate from one another. And when you feel like you are separate, of course, why wouldn't violence occur? Of course. When I view that I'm me and you're you, of course, why wouldn't I treat you one way? Now, what happens when I instantly go, I am part of the divine, and we are all part of that thing? It changes. That also changes the way we interact and the way we speak. And it becomes a total different driving force behind our language. So, what's your intent by what you're saying? Are you being clear with your words? Is what you're saying building up or tearing down? When you're with someone, what is their intent? What's their perception? What got them to where they are today? When they come at you with an attacking statement, when they come at you with judgment, what brought them where they are today? Because when all else fails, let's let silence be the great interpreter. And we'll leave it at that. Everything is sacred. My goodness, I feel like that changes everything. It's hard to see sometimes that everything is sacred when the sacredness in front of your face might be argumentative. The sacred in front of your face might be something you don't like. The sacred in front of your face might be a mirror pointing back at you. The sacredness is hard. The sacredness is there. This has been probably one of the most transformative thoughts in my faith, is seeing that God, whatever word you want to use, is in all. is in all. And that transforms the way you look and move in the world. And I think that whatever this kingdom that is used often, that Jesus talks about, whatever that word kingdom means to us now, I think is hinting at there is something we are invited into, participating in, that is much bigger and beyond ourselves. Whether you look at it as a supernatural thing or a very here, right now on this earth, there's something we're invited and participating in. And what are we building? And I think that we're building something that actually is probably restoring something. We're probably restoring more than we're building. A sense of oneness. I'm comfortable using that word oneness, but you might look at it as a togetherness. I don't know why. I call it my old evangelical roots. But I just sort of felt like that stirring in my heart as I was sitting here in the front row. Like, this is what we're after. This is what we're after. We're after the repair of this world. And that starts here. That starts here, not with everybody else, although that is a really fun task to try to fix everybody. I don't advise it. It starts here, right? And then it starts with the people together. And then it starts a little bit from there and a little bit from there. And One Church, I just feel like that is the road we are on. That's the road. We've been on a road of change for a long time. And I feel like that's the road we're on, is to do more reparative work, to remind people of their origin of love and goodness. And that means every single person on this planet. So I'm going to leave you with that. One Church, I am proud to be in your presence. One Church, may you and the sound system, because it's touchy, may you know peace and grace. May you have hopefully some understanding where there's misunderstanding. May you have some grace where there's lots of impatience on both maybe your part and on the other part. Maybe you have a little bit of unity where it feels like there's forced uniformity. May you have, as what the Bible would say, a peace that surpasses all understanding. Go in peace. And we'll see you not next Saturday. Don't come next Saturday. Next Saturday is Sabbath Saturday. Please enjoy and go be on vacation like the rest of the church. We'll see you the first week of August, okay? Take care.